Castles were meant to be unbreakable monuments of stone and iron, designed to withstand armies, sieges, and time itself. Their walls stood as symbols of power, their gates guarded by men sworn to protect them at all costs. But what happens when the guardians become the destroyers? When the very hands trusted to hold the fortress steady are the ones to push it into ruin? This is the dark, twisting tale of siege masters who turned traitor, men who dismantled their own strongholds from within. It's a story of ambition, desperation, and the ultimate betrayal, one that reshaped the fate of kingdoms and rewrote the rules of medieval warfare. Picture this, a castle under siege, its defenders holding firm against relentless attacks. The enemy hurls stones, scales walls, and digs tunnels, but the fortress stands. Then, in the dead of night, a gate creaks open, not by force, not by trickery, but by the command of the man who was supposed to keep it shut. Why would a siege master, a master of defense, become the architect of his own castle's downfall? The answers are as complex as they are shocking. Some sought gold, others power, and some were driven by fear or survival. But all of them made a choice that would echo through history, leaving behind shattered stone and broken oaths. These betrayals weren't just moments of personal treachery, they were earthquakes that shook the medieval world. A single act of treason could topple dynasties, shift the balance of power, and rewrite the strategies of war. Kings learned to fear their own defenders as much as their enemies. Armies began to question who they could trust, and the very idea of loyalty was forever stained by the shadow of these turncoats. So join us as we step into the torchlit corridors of history, where the line between hero and villain blurs, and the greatest threat to a castle wasn't the army outside, but the traitor within. This is the story of the men who brought down their own walls, and the legacy of their betrayals that still lingers in the stones of ruined fortresses today. Siege masters were the unsung engineers of medieval warfare, the minds behind the walls that kept kingdoms safe. Their expertise wasn't just about building towering fortresses, it was about predicting every possible weakness, every crack an enemy might exploit. These men spent years mastering the art of defense, studying the way stones settled, how gates could be reinforced, and where hidden tunnels might be dug. They weren't just builders, they were strategists, tacticians who could turn a castle into an impenetrable puzzle. And that's exactly what made them so dangerous when they switched sides. Imagine knowing every secret passage, every hidden weak point in a fortress's design. That was the power siege masters held. Their loyalty wasn't just expected, it was the bedrock of a kingdom's survival. Kings and lords relied on them completely, trusting them with the blueprints to their power. But trust in the medieval world was a fragile thing. A siege master's knowledge was as valuable to an enemy as an army of 10,000 men. And when gold, threats, or ambition whispered in their ears, some found the temptation impossible to resist. Training a siege master wasn't quick or easy. It took decades of apprenticeship, learning from seasoned masters who passed down tricks of the trade like closely guarded secrets. They memorized the way different stones weathered sieges, how to reinforce gates against battering rams, even where to place boiling oil traps for maximum effect. Their work was meticulous, their attention to detail obsessive, but that same precision made them vulnerable. A single flaw they knew about could be sold to the highest bidder. A single moment of doubt could undo years of loyalty. The most chilling part, these betrayals weren't just about greed. Some siege masters turned traitor because they'd seen the tides of war shifting and chose survival over honor. Others were coerced, their families threatened if they didn't comply, and a rare few acted out of vengeance, settling personal scores by bringing down the very walls they'd built. Whatever the reason, their defections sent shockwaves through medieval society. If the men who designed the defenses couldn't be trusted, who could? It forced kings to rethink their strategies, spreading command among multiple engineers to prevent any one person from holding too much power. But by then, the damage was often done, a gate left unbarred, a wall deliberately weakened, and a castle that crumbled not from outside force, but from the betrayal of the one man who knew all its secrets. Château Gaillard stood as a crowning achievement of medieval engineering, a fortress so formidable it was said to be impregnable. Built by Richard the Lionheart high above the Seine River, its concentric walls and clever defenses made it the jewel of Norman territory, until one man's betrayal shattered that reputation overnight. The year was 1204, and the castle's fate rested in the hands of a siege master whose name history barely remembers, but whose actions changed the course of the Anglo-French wars forever. This forgotten engineer knew Château Gaillard's secrets like the lines on his own hands. He'd overseen repairs, reinforced weak points, and walked every inch of its storied walls. But when King Philip II of France laid siege, something snapped. Maybe it was resentment over unpaid wages, or whispers of promised riches from the French crown. Whatever the reason, he made a choice that would echo through the centuries. Under cover of darkness, he revealed the castle's fatal flaw, a poorly guarded latrine chute in the outer ward, wide enough for soldiers to climb. The French forces didn't storm the gates, they crept in through the filth. While defenders kept watch for battering rams and scaling ladders, enemy troops waded through sewage, emerging inside the fortress like ghosts. By morning, Château Gaillard's inner sanctum had fallen without a single wall breached. Richard's masterpiece, designed to withstand years of siege, collapsed in mere months, not from force but from treachery. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological earthquake. The fall of Château Gaillard proved no castle was truly unconquerable if the mind behind its defenses turned traitor. King Philip's victory sent shockwaves through England, emboldening French ambitions and weakening Norman control. More crucially, it exposed a terrifying truth. The greatest threat to any fortress wasn't the enemy outside, but the knowledge inside a single man's head. The repercussions spread far beyond that one battle. English commanders began rotating siege masters between castles to prevent any one engineer from knowing too much. Fortress designs grew more compartmentalized, with different teams working on separate sections so no individual held all the secrets. Even royal architects faced new scrutiny, their loyalties questioned as never before. The shadow of Château Gaillard's betrayal lingered for generations, a stark reminder that stone walls meant nothing without unshakable loyalty. Greed might seem like the obvious culprit. After all, medieval wars were fought as much with purses as with swords. Enemy lords often dangled fortunes in front of siege masters, knowing their knowledge was worth more than an entire battalion. But dig deeper, and you'll find motives far more tangled than simple gold lust. Take the case of a Welsh engineer in the 13th century who defected to the English not for payment, but because his own lord had executed his brother over a disputed fort design. That wasn't betrayal for profit, it was a calculated act of revenge, cold and personal. Survival played its part too. When a castle was hopelessly surrounded, some siege masters saw surrender as the only way to spare their families. In 1487, during the siege of Malaga, a Spanish engineer famously lowered the drawbridge to the attacking forces after weeks of starvation. His name was erased from records, branded a coward, but can we blame a man who watched children gnawing on leather belts in the streets? The brutal calculus of war forced impossible choices: die honorably for a lost cause, or live dishonored but save hundreds. Then there were those trapped in political webs beyond their control. A Burgundian siege master in 1415 switched sides mid-campaign when his duke was assassinated, leaving him suddenly oathless in a nest of scheming nobles. Loyalty in the Middle Ages wasn't just personal, it was feudal, tied to land and title. When those bonds snapped, so did allegiances, but perhaps the most unsettling betrayals came from sheer disillusionment. After decades of service, some engineers grew weary of lords who ignored their warnings about crumbling walls or diverted defense funds to lavish feasts. When an invading army arrived promising respect and better pay, the temptation to abandon negligent masters proved too strong. These weren't sudden betrayals, but slow, burning resentments, the final act in years of fractured trust. What unites all these stories is the human element behind the treason. These weren't faceless villains twirling mustaches, they were men pushed to breaking points by war's relentless pressures. Their choices reshaped battles, yes, but also exposed the fragile threads holding medieval society together: honor, loyalty, and the unspoken contract between those who built the walls and those who ruled behind them. The siege of Antioch in 1098 should have been a triumph for the defenders, a chance to prove their fortress could withstand even the most determined crusaders. Instead, it became one of history's most shocking betrayals, a collapse orchestrated not by force but by the whispered secrets of a man who'd sworn to protect the city's walls. Antioch wasn't just any stronghold. It was the gateway to the Holy Land, a prize so valuable that its fall would ripple across the entire Crusades. And when a renegade siege master chose to sabotage his own defenses, he didn't just hand the city to the enemy, he rewrote the rules of holy war. This unnamed traitor wasn't some lowly soldier bribed with a handful of coins. He was a master of his craft, intimately familiar with Antioch's sprawling defenses, the thickness of its walls, the blind spots in its towers, even the hidden passages meant for last-minute escapes. For months, the Crusaders had hurled themselves against those walls, dying in droves under a hail of arrows and boiling pitch. Then, suddenly, everything changed. The siege master began slipping intelligence to the enemy, revealing where the defenses were thinnest, when the guard rotations slackened, even how to scale the supposedly unclimbable southern ramparts. Why, the reasons were as layered as Antioch's own fortifications. Some chroniclers claim he was swayed by religious fervor, convinced the Crusaders' cause was divinely favored. Others whisper of chests of Byzantine gold smuggled into his chambers under cover of night. But the most chilling possibility is that he simply saw the writing on the wall: the Crusaders weren't giving up, and Antioch's fall was inevitable. Better to switch sides and survive than perish for a lost cause. Whatever his motives, his treachery had immediate consequences. On the night of June 2nd, Crusader forces poured through a poorly guarded section of the walls, their path cleared by the siege master's detailed instructions. By dawn, Antioch was in flames, its defenders slaughtered or enslaved. The fallout was catastrophic. Antioch's fall didn't just hand the Crusaders a strategic victory, it shattered the myth of Muslim invincibility in the region, emboldening Christian forces to push deeper into the Holy Land. More insidiously, it planted a seed of doubt in every medieval commander's mind. If even the most skilled siege master could turn traitor, how could any fortress truly be safe? The Crusades had always been fought with swords and faith, but after Antioch, they were waged with whispers and bribes too. What makes this betrayal so haunting isn't just the scale of its consequences, but how it exposes the fragility of loyalty in the face of war's chaos. The siege master of Antioch didn't act out of cartoonish villainy. He was a man caught between duty, survival, and the crushing weight of history. His choice didn't just doom a city, it proved that in the calculus of medieval warfare, even the strongest walls were no match for the weakness of human resolve. The moment a siege master turned traitor, he gambled not just with his life but with his legacy. For some, the gamble paid off handsomely. Take the case of a French engineer in 1346 who defected during the siege of Aiglun. When he slipped the English attackers details about the fortress's weak points, he was showered with land, titles, and a place at the victor's court. But such rewards came laced with poison. Even as he dined in luxury, whispers followed him turncoat, oathbreaker labels no amount of gold could erase. And when political winds shifted years later, his benefactors conveniently forgot their promises, leaving him to die penniless and despised. Far more common was the traitor's noose. Medieval justice had no patience for betrayal, especially from those entrusted with a kingdom's defenses. Records from the War of the Roses describe one English siege master dragged through the streets of York behind a horse after revealing castle secrets to the Lancastrians. His execution wasn't just punishment, it was theatre, a grim warning to others contemplating treachery. Some faced even crueler fates. The chronicler Froissart recounts a Flemish engineer boiled alive in his own cauldron of pitch after helping the French breach Ghent's walls. These weren't mere deaths, they were spectacles designed to sear the cost of betrayal into public memory. Yet exile could be worse than execution. Stripped of honor and homeland, banished traitors became ghosts in foreign lands. A Spanish siege master who aided the Moors in 1423 spent his final years wandering North Africa, begging for scraps while dictating tear-stained letters to his estranged children. Without patronage or protection, these men often met violent ends in back alleys or slave markets, their expertise meaningless without a lord to employ it. The deepest scars, though, were borne by their descendants. Traitors' families faced generations of stigma, lands confiscated, marriages annulled, surnames spat like curses. In Nuremberg's archives, there's a heartbreaking petition from 1508, the grandson of a disgraced siege master pleading for the right to bear a sword, his birthright denied because of his grandfather's crimes 60 years prior. Bloodlines tainted by treason rarely recovered, no matter how much time passed. What's striking isn't just the severity of these punishments, but how they reveal medieval society's deepest fears. A rogue knight could be defeated in battle, but a traitorous siege master undermined the very idea of safety. His betrayal wasn't just personal, it shattered the trust holding the feudal world together. That's why his punishment had to be unforgettable, a lesson carved into history's stone. In an age built on walls and oaths, some sins could never be washed clean. Edinburgh Castle stood as the unshakable heart of English power in Scotland, a fortress so mighty it was thought to be untouchable. Perched high on its volcanic rock, its walls had defied countless attacks during the wars of Scottish independence. But in the spring of 1314, those walls didn't crumble under siege. They were opened from within, not by force, but by the quiet treachery of a man whose name history has tried to erase. This wasn't just a surrender, it was a masterstroke of deception that would alter the course of Scotland's fight for freedom. The siege master in question had spent years maintaining Edinburgh's defenses, studying every weak point, every vulnerable stretch of stone. He knew the castle's secrets better than anyone, the hidden postern gates, the overworked sentry rotations, even the crumbling section of the eastern wall masked by fresh mortar. When Robert the Bruce's forces surrounded the fortress, conventional wisdom said they'd face months of grueling siege. But Bruce didn't need battering rams or scaling ladders. He needed just one man willing to trade loyalty for opportunity, What tempted the siege master? Some chronicles hint at gold smuggled into his chambers by Scottish agents. Others suggest blackmail, a secret vice or family shame threatened with exposure. But the most compelling theory is far simpler. He saw the future. England's grip on Scotland was slipping after Bruce's stunning victory at Bannockburn, and clinging to a doomed cause made no sense. Whatever his motives, the deal was struck in shadow. On the night of March 14th, under the guise of inspecting the walls, the siege master ordered the guards at the eastern gate distracted. Scottish forces slipped inside like mist, disarming sentries before alarms could sound. By dawn, the castle's banners were being replaced without a single life lost. The consequences were seismic. Edinburgh's fall wasn't just a tactical win, it was a psychological earthquake. With the English stronghold gone, Bruce's legitimacy as Scotland's king solidified overnight. The surrender demoralized English garrisons across the region, sparking a wave of defections. More crucially, it proved Bruce wasn't just a battlefield commander. He was a strategist who understood the power of patience and persuasion. Why waste lives storming walls when one well-placed betrayal could achieve the same result? Yet the siege master's fate remains a haunting mystery. Some accounts claim Bruce rewarded him with lands, only for him to vanish into obscurity. Others insist English agents hunted him down, his body left unburied as a warning. What's undeniable is how his betrayal reshaped medieval warfare. Kings realized castles weren't just physical fortresses, they were human ones. A single disloyal engineer could undo decades of planning. In the years that followed, commanders grew paranoid, rotating garrison officers and compartmentalizing fortress knowledge. Edinburgh's fall taught a brutal lesson. The strongest walls are only as unbreakable as the loyalty of those who guard them. The most dangerous traitors weren't always the ones who openly switched sides. Some siege masters mastered the art of the double game, weaving webs of deception so intricate that even their allies couldn't be sure where their loyalties truly lay. These men didn't just betray, they manipulated, feeding false weaknesses to enemy commanders while secretly strengthening defenses elsewhere. It was a high-stakes gamble where one misstep could mean torture or execution, but the rewards shaping entire battles without lifting a sword were irresistible to the cunning few who dared. Consider the case of a German engineer during the 30 Years' War, documented only as H in crumbling imperial records. For months, he pretended to collaborate with Swedish besiegers, handing them detailed plans of a Bavarian fortress's vulnerable northern wall. The Swedes massed their forces there, only to find the stones reinforced with hidden iron rods, their battering rams snapping like twigs. Meanwhile, the real weak point, a poorly drained southern trench, had been quietly fortified. By the time the Swedes realized they'd been played, torrential rains turned their camp into a swamp, disease ravaged their ranks, and the siege collapsed without a single assault. H didn't just defend a castle, he weaponized his enemies' trust. This shadow warfare demanded nerves of steel. Double-agent siege masters often endured brutal interrogations to sell their falsehoods, letting themselves be captured or tortured to leak convincing misinformation. A Venetian account from 1483 describes an engineer who allowed his fingernails to be pulled out by Ottoman agents, screaming fabricated details about cistern locations, details that later led the Sultan's troops into a deadly ambush. The line between hero and traitor grew dangerously thin in these moments. Was lying to the enemy loyalty to one's own side, or merely another form of betrayal wearing a mask? The psychological toll was crushing. Living under constant suspicion from both factions, these men couldn't afford a single unguarded word. A Burgundian chronicle tells of a siege master who maintained his ruse so perfectly that his own son, fighting for the opposing army, died in a trap the father had designed. When the truth finally emerged, the victors hailed him as a genius, but the man reportedly spent his final years in a monastery, unable to bear the weight of his choices. What makes these stories so unsettling isn't just the tactical brilliance, but how they expose the fluid morality of medieval warfare. In an age where oaths were sacred, these siege masters proved loyalty could be a weapon too, bending truth to serve their cause. Their legacies linger in modern military deception tactics, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful defenses aren't made of stone, but of lies artfully told. Harlech Castle loomed over the Welsh coast like a clenched English fist, its concentric walls and sea-facing cliffs, making it one of the most impregnable strongholds in all of Britain. For years, it had been a bastion of English dominance, a place where Welsh rebellions went to die. But in the bitter winter of 1409, the impossible happened. Harlech fell not to an army, but to the quiet treachery of a man who'd spent his life maintaining its defenses. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a rebellion of the soul, orchestrated by a Welsh siege master who'd finally had enough of foreign rule. The man's name is lost to history, but his motives echo through time. Born into a family of craftsmen who'd served the English crown for generations, he'd watched as Welsh language and customs were suppressed, as his people were treated as second-class citizens in their own land. When Owain Glyndwr's rebellion began sweeping across Wales, something inside him snapped. The castle's weaknesses, the very flaws he'd spent years patching, became his tools for liberation. Under the guise of routine repairs, he deliberately left a section of the outer wall near the sea gate undermanned, whispering to Glyndwr's agents about the exact hour when the guard shifts overlapped. The attack came on a night when sleet lashed the battlements, the weather so foul that sentries huddled near braziers instead of walking their posts. Welsh rebels scaled the neglected seaward cliffs, their path illuminated by the siege master's carefully placed torches, a signal masked as routine maintenance lights. By the time the alarm was raised, Glyndwr's men were already inside the inner ward, their swords glinting in the storm. The castle that had resisted full-scale assaults for months surrendered in less than an hour, its English garrison captured without a single Welsh life lost. Glyndwr wasted no time turning Harlech into a symbol. From its towers, he proclaimed himself Prince of Wales, minted coins bearing his crest, and even entertained foreign ambassadors, proving Wales could stand as a nation. The siege master, now a hero to his people, was said to have wept as Glyndwr's banner rose over the battlements, not just from joy, but from the weight of his broken oath. In that moment, he embodied the agonizing choice every traitor faces: loyalty to crown or kin, duty or justice. But triumph came at a brutal price. When English forces retook Harlech 5 years later, their vengeance was methodical. Welsh defenders were hanged from the castle walls, their bodies left to rot as a warning. The siege master's fate is unrecorded, but Glyndwr's rebellion collapsed soon after, its leaders hunted into hiding. Yet the legacy of that betrayal endured. Harlech became a rallying cry for Welsh nationalism, proof that even the mightiest English fortresses weren't invincible if the hearts guarding them turned. Centuries later, bards still sing of the night a son of Wales used his enemies' own strength against them, a reminder that castles, like empires, are only as strong as the loyalties of those who hold the keys. Medieval lords slept with one eye open, knowing their most trusted engineers could become their greatest threats. To combat betrayal, they devised systems of control so intricate they bordered on obsession. Take hostage-taking, a brutal but standard practice. When a siege master was assigned to a critical fortress, his family might be whisked away to a noble's estate, living comfortably but under guard. The message was clear: loyalty wasn't just expected, it was enforced. A Flemish record from 1392 chillingly notes how an engineer's young son was paraded before the castle walls during a siege, a silent reminder of the cost of treachery. Oaths weren't mere formalities, they were psychological traps woven with divine consequences. Siege masters swore vows on sacred relics, their hands pressed to swords or gospels, while curses were pronounced against any who broke faith. In Burgundy, engineers pledged allegiance over the tomb of Saint Denis, believing their souls would be damned if they betrayed their lords, yet these theatrical rituals often failed. The same engineer who kissed a crucifix one day might sell secrets the next when faced with a heavier purse or sharper threats. Some rulers turned to bureaucratic paranoia. Venetian archives reveal how the Republic split fortress blueprints among 3 separate architects, each knowing only a third of the design. Workers were deliberately misled about which sections they were reinforcing, and false weak points were built into walls to confuse potential traitors. The Byzantine Empire took it further. Siege masters were paired with shadow engineers, each ordered to watch the other for signs of disloyalty. This climate of suspicion bred its own dangers. Talented men avoided military service rather than live under constant scrutiny. The most desperate lords resorted to grotesque incentives. After the fall of Rouen in 1419, English commanders began paying siege masters with lands confiscated from executed traitors, a macabre cycle where betrayal funded loyalty. Others offered blood bonuses, extravagant rewards for engineers who uncovered plots among their peers, but these measures often backfired. A German chronicle tells of 2 brothers, both siege masters, accused of treason by a rival hungry for their rewards. Their executions left a key fortress defenseless, proving that paranoia could be as destructive as any traitor. What's striking isn't that these measures failed, it's how consistently they underestimated human complexity. You can chain a man's family or threaten his soul, but ambition, fear, or righteous anger will always find cracks in the strongest systems. The Lord's greatest miscalculation was believing loyalty could be engineered like castle walls, when history shows it's far more fragile and far more human. Constantinople in 1453 was a shadow of its former glory, but still a marvel of medieval defense. Its massive triple walls had repelled invaders for centuries, a labyrinth of fortifications that made the city seem invincible. Yet all it took was one man, a Venetian engineer named Giovanni Giustiniani, to tip the scales toward disaster. His defection to the Ottomans wasn't just a betrayal, it was the final crack in an empire already crumbling under its own weight. Giustiniani arrived in Constantinople as a hero, hired by Emperor Constantine XI to bolster the city's defenses against Sultan Mehmed II's impending siege. A master of Renaissance military engineering, he reinforced weak points, trained defenders, and even designed mobile barricades to counter Ottoman cannon fire. For weeks, his leadership held the line until the night of May 29th, when everything changed. As Ottoman forces launched their final assault, Giustiniani was struck by a stray arrow or cannonball. Accounts differ. What happened next remains one of history's most debated betrayals. Some chroniclers claim he panicked, demanding to be carried off the walls despite the battle's critical moment. Others whisper he'd been secretly negotiating with the Ottomans, his injury merely cover for a planned retreat. Whatever the truth, his sudden absence created chaos. The Genoese mercenaries under his command, seeing their leader vanish, lost heart and abandoned their posts. In the resulting confusion, Ottoman troops breached a poorly guarded sally port called the Kirkaporta, a gate Giustiniani had allegedly neglected to reinforce properly. Within hours, the city that had stood for a millennium fell. The consequences were apocalyptic. Constantinople's fall didn't just mark the end of the Byzantine Empire, it sent shockwaves through Christendom. The Ottomans now controlled the gateway between Europe and Asia, their dominance unchallenged. But the deeper tragedy lay in the betrayal symbolism. Giustiniani, a foreigner hired for his expertise, embodied the empire's fatal reliance on mercenaries and outsiders. His defection exposed the rot within a civilization so weakened it could no longer inspire loyalty even from those paid to defend it. Maimed understood the power of this narrative. He rewarded Giustiniani's alleged collaborators with lands and titles, while Byzantine loyalists were slaughtered or enslaved. The message was clear: in the new order, pragmatism trumped old oaths. Yet the engineer's own fate remains murky. Some say he died of his wounds en route to Genoa. Others claim he lived in shame, haunted by the empire he'd helped destroy. What's undeniable is his legacy, proof that even the mightiest walls are only as strong as the will of those who guard them. Constantinople's fall wasn't just a military defeat, it was a masterclass in how betrayal can rewrite history. Treason wasn't always a black and white crime in the medieval mind. What one king called betrayal, another might call divine providence. Take the curious case of the 12th century French knight who defected to the English after his lord seized his ancestral land. Chroniclers of the time didn't uniformly condemn him. Some framed his switch as righteous resistance to tyranny. This moral flexibility reveals a world where loyalty was often conditional, tied less to abstract ideals and more to the practical realities of survival and justice. Religious authority complicated matters further. When a siege master abandoned his post during the Albigensian crusade, claiming his conscience couldn't serve heretics, the church debated for months whether his actions constituted treason or piety. Bishops split over whether breaking an oath to an excommunicated lord was sinful, proof that even medieval moralists recognized shades of gray in allegiance. The eventual verdict: his betrayal, was pardoned, setting a precedent that would haunt commanders for centuries. Peasant uprisings added another layer. During the Jacquerie Revolt of 1358, French engineers joined the rebels after watching nobles burn their villages. Contemporary accounts are startlingly sympathetic. One monk's chronicle describes their defection not as treason, but as the desperate justice of the oppressed. These weren't men swayed by gold or ambition. They were craftsmen pushed to rebellion by unbearable cruelty. Their actions forced medieval society to confront an uncomfortable question: when does loyalty to one's people outweigh loyalty to one's lords? The most fascinating justifications emerged from shifting political winds. After Henry VII seized the English throne in 1485, former Yorkist siege masters who switched sides weren't executed, they were quietly reinstated. Pragmatism trumped punishment. Henry needed their skills to secure his unstable reign. This calculated forgiveness exposed a truth rulers rarely admitted: treason was only unforgivable when it failed. Succeed, and history might just rebrand you a visionary. What's clear is that medieval ethics were as layered as castle walls. While ballads and chronicles glorified unshakable loyalty, real-life judgments often hinged on context: who betrayed whom, why, and whether the betrayer ultimately won. The line between traitor and hero wasn't drawn in stone, but in the shifting sands of power, survival, and sometimes genuine moral conviction. Crac des Chevaliers was the crown jewel of Crusader fortresses, a mountain stronghold so formidable it was called the key to Christendom. Perched high in Syria's hills, its massive walls had defied sieges for over a century, a symbol of unyielding Christian resistance. Yet in 1271, this bastion fell without a single wall breached. Its surrender orchestrated not by force, but by the whispered negotiations of a Hospitaller siege master whose name history has deliberately obscured. What drove a man sworn to defend the faith to secretly parley with the enemy? The answer lies in the brutal calculus of a losing war. The siege master faced an impossible choice. Sultan Baybar's Mamluk army surrounded Krak with overwhelming numbers, their siege engines pounding the walls day and night. Inside, supplies dwindled as hundreds of civilians, women, children, elderly huddled in the vaults, their cries echoing through the stone corridors. The fortress could likely have held out for months, maybe years, but at what cost? The siege master knew the Mamluks' grim reputation. Cities that resisted too long were often put to the sword when they finally fell. By negotiating a secret surrender, he gambled that honorable terms might spare the innocent. Baybars, ever the strategist, recognized an opportunity. Instead of demanding unconditional surrender, he crafted an ingenious ruse. A forged letter, supposedly from the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, was smuggled into the fortress, ordering the defenders to stand down. Whether the siege master believed it or simply used it as cover remains debated. What's certain is that the gates opened peacefully. The Mamluks marched in, not as conquerors slaughtering the defeated, but as honorable victors allowing safe passage to the surviving defenders. Krak's fall sent shockwaves through the Crusader states, not because it was lost, but because it was surrendered. Modern historians still clash over the siege master's legacy. Some brand him a coward who doomed Christian footholds in the Holy Land. Others argue he was a humanitarian ahead of his time, prioritizing lives over symbolism. The truth may be messier. Perhaps he was simply a pragmatist reading the tides of war. The Crusader cause was crumbling, and no castle, no matter how mighty, could hold back the inevitable. His betrayal, if it was one, didn't stem from greed or ambition, but from the sober realization that sometimes the greatest act of leadership is knowing when to lay down the sword. The haunting lesson of Krak isn't about treachery, it's about the weight of command. The siege master's decision forced the medieval world to confront an uncomfortable question. Is loyalty to an ideal worth the sacrifice of every soul entrusted to your care? Krak's walls still stand today, their stones silent witnesses to that fateful choice. They remind us that even the strongest fortresses are human constructs, and human hearts, not stone, are where wars are truly won or lost. For every siege master who faltered, there were those who stood unshaken, men whose loyalty endured even when kingdoms crumbled around them. Take the case of Bertrand du Guesclin, the Breton knight who defended Rennes in 1357 against an English siege so brutal, his enemies resorted to catapulting rotting carcasses over the walls. Offered vast estates and titles to surrender, he reportedly laughed at the messengers, declaring, "A man's worth is measured by his word, not his lands." His defiance wasn't just stubbornness, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. By holding Rennes, he forced the English to exhaust precious resources, weakening their grip on France for years to come. Then there's the lesser-known but equally remarkable story of a Scottish engineer named Alastair MacRuari, keeper of Stirling Castle during the Wars of Independence. Captured by English forces and tortured for weeks, he refused to reveal the castle's hidden water supply, a secret that would have doomed the garrison. His sacrifice bought precious time for Robert the Bruce's forces to regroup. What's astonishing isn't just his endurance, but the ripple effect of his silence. Stirling held out long enough to become a rallying point, proving that one man's resolve could alter the momentum of an entire war. Loyalty often came at a steeper price than betrayal. During the Siege of Rhodes in 1522, Siege Master Philippe Villiers de L'Isle-Adam oversaw repairs on shattered walls while dysentery ravaged his men and Ottoman cannon fire shook the foundations. Offered safe passage if he sabotaged the defenses, he instead orchestrated a daring nighttime counterattack that destroyed enemy siege towers. His leadership didn't just save Rhodes temporarily, it cemented the Knights Hospitallers' reputation for unbreakable resolve, inspiring generations of defenders. These men shared an unspoken understanding. Their loyalty wasn't to stone walls, but to the people sheltering behind them. When the Burgundians besieged Oudenaarde in 1452, engineer Jules van Wingheen turned down a bribe that would have made him richer than his lord. Why? Because he designed the city's flood defenses himself and knew opening the gates would drown thousands of civilians in the Scheldt River. His choice reminds us that behind every oath stood human lives, a truth some siege masters carried like armor. The legacy of these loyalists reshaped medieval warfare in subtle but profound ways. Kings began rewarding steadfast engineers with hereditary titles, tying their families' futures to the realm's survival. Fortress designs evolved to include loyalty checks, redundant systems where no single person controlled critical mechanisms. Most importantly, they proved that while treachery might win battles, integrity won wars. Their stories echo in the ruins of castles that still stand today, not because their walls were perfect, but because the hearts guarding them refused to break. Bamberg Castle had withstood sieges for centuries, its massive sandstone walls towering over the North Sea like an unbreakable sentinel. By 1464, it had become the last Lancastrian stronghold holding out against Yorkist dominance in the Wars of the Roses, a final flicker of resistance in a conflict that had already consumed England for decades. But its fate wouldn't be decided by battering rams or starvation. It would crumble from within, betrayed by the very man entrusted with its survival. The siege master's name has been scrubbed from official records, but fragments of correspondence suggest he was a seasoned veteran, handpicked by the Lancastrians for his expertise in coastal defenses. For months, he'd overseen Bamberg's preparations, reinforcing gatehouses and stockpiling supplies against the inevitable Yorkist assault. Yet behind closed doors, he'd been negotiating with the enemy. Some claim the Yorkists offered him lands confiscated from Lancastrian loyalists. Others whisper that he'd grown disillusioned with the Lancastrian cause after their disastrous defeat at Towton. Whatever his motives, his treachery was methodical. When the Earl of Warwick's forces arrived, the siege master didn't just open a gate, he orchestrated a masterclass in subterfuge. Under the guise of repairing the western curtain wall, he deliberately weakened a critical section, leaving it vulnerable to concentrated cannon fire. As Yorkist artillery pounded the spot he'd sabotaged, defenders rushed to the breach, only to find the inner gates mysteriously jammed. By the time they realized they'd been betrayed, Warwick's men were already streaming through the chaos. The castle that had defied William the Conqueror fell in a single day, its capture shockingly bloodless. The political aftershocks were immediate. With Bamberg gone, Lancastrian resistance in the north collapsed entirely. Henry VI, already a fugitive, lost his last viable stronghold, forcing him into exile and cementing Yorkist control. But the deeper impact was psychological. Warwick, later nicknamed the Kingmaker, learned a brutal lesson. In this new era of warfare, loyalty was a currency, not a virtue. He began systematically recruiting enemy engineers, sparking a bidding war for expertise that would redefine medieval power struggles. What makes this betrayal so chilling isn't just its efficiency, but how it exposed the fragility of feudal allegiance. The siege master wasn't some lowborn mercenary. He was a trusted professional, a man whose skills should have made him indispensable. His defection proved that even the most seasoned experts could be swayed when dynasties clashed. In the years that followed, English castles adopted grim new protocols, nightly password rotations, segmented blueprints, even chaining gates shut with multiple locks controlled by different officers. Bamberg's fall didn't just change the war, it changed how rulers thought about defense, planting seeds of paranoia that would bloom into the spy networks and counterintelligence tactics of the Renaissance. The castle itself became a monument to this shift. Where once it had symbolized unyielding power, its New Yorkist garrison treated it with wary suspicion. Visitors noted how its storied halls now echoed with whispered accusations, its defenders as watchful of each other as of any external threat. The stones still stood, but the trust that had once bound them together was gone, shattered not by siege engines, but by the quiet, calculating betrayal of one man who knew exactly where to strike. The moment castles began falling from within, military commanders faced a nightmare scenario. How do you defend against an enemy who already knows your weaknesses? The betrayals of siege masters didn't just cost individual fortresses, they forced a complete overhaul of medieval warfare's playbook. Kings who once poured resources into thicker walls now invested in something far more elusive: trust. And proving trustworthiness became as critical as any siege engine or moat. One of the first changes was the fragmentation of knowledge. No longer would a single engineer hold the full blueprint to a fortress. Venetian records from the late 14th century show how castle designs were deliberately split among multiple architects, each working on isolated sections. A gate specialist might design the portcullis without knowing the layout of the tunnels beneath it, while a stonemason reinforced walls without understanding their structural relationship to the keep. This compartmentalization made betrayal far less catastrophic. A turncoat could only sell fragments of the puzzle. Loyalty tests grew increasingly elaborate. In Burgundy, aspiring siege masters underwent grueling interrogations disguised as casual conversations. A scribe might accidentally leave sensitive plans unattended, while hidden observers noted who lingered too long. Some lords staged fake sieges, planting actors posing as enemy agents to gauge their engineers' reactions. The most paranoid rulers, like Henry V of England, required sworn oaths sealed with blood, not just the engineers but those of his entire family. Fortress architecture itself evolved to counter insider threats. The classic concentric walls of earlier castles gave way to labyrinthine designs with redundant defenses. Engineers added murder switches, hidden mechanisms that could seal off sections of a castle if treachery was suspected. At Malbork Castle in Prussia, a single lever controlled multiple drawbridges, allowing defenders to trap betrayers mid-flight. Even gatehouses were reimagined. Double portal systems forced entrants to pass through two successive gates, with murder holes above where loyal guards could rain down arrows if the first gate was suspiciously opened. Perhaps the most profound shift was psychological. Medieval warfare had always prized honor, but post-betrayal, commanders embraced ruthless pragmatism. Mercenary engineers, once hired for their skills alone, now faced invasive background checks. Payrolls swelled with spies posing as apprentices, watching for any hint of disloyalty. The French even pioneered a crude form of institutional memory, compiling treason dossiers that tracked which families had produced traitors, barring their descendants from sensitive positions for generations. These changes rippled beyond the battlefield. The very concept of military expertise transformed. Where once a siege master's value lay in his technical brilliance, now it hinged equally on his connections and reputation. Patronage networks grew tighter, with engineers vouching for each other in chains of accountability. A betrayal didn't just doom the traitor, it could blacklist his entire guild. This professional stigma became its own deterrent, as powerful as any punishment. Yet for all these precautions, the specter of treachery never fully vanished. If anything, the arms race between traitors and those hunting them grew more sophisticated. By the Renaissance, the same ingenuity that once built impregnable walls was now devoted to building systems where no single human link could break the chain. The greatest legacy of these betrayals wasn't just stronger castles, It was the grim understanding that in war, the mind was always the ultimate battleground. Montsega's fortress clung to its Pyrenean peak like a defiant fist against the sky, a sanctuary for the Cathars, the so-called heretics hunted by the Albigensian Crusade. By 1244, it was the last refuge of a dying faith, its walls packed with men, women, and children who'd rather starve than renounce their beliefs. But when the Crusaders finally breached its defenses, whispers spread like poison. The castle hadn't fallen to force. It had been sold. The name of the accused siege master is lost, erased by time or deliberate censure, but the shadow of his alleged betrayal stretches across centuries, tangled in questions of faith, survival, and historical vengeance. Cathar chronicles tell of a man cornered by impossible choices. After months of siege, with supplies dwindling and hope fading, he reportedly slipped past the Crusaders' lines to negotiate terms. Some say he sought safe passage for the civilians. Others claim he bargained for his own life. The Crusaders' records, predictably, paint him as a coward who revealed hidden paths in exchange for mercy. But here's the thornier truth. Montsega's defenders were given 15 days to surrender and used them to smuggle out treasure and sacred texts under the Crusaders' noses. Was this the work of a traitor or a desperate gambit to salvage something from the wreckage? The siege master's fate only deepens the mystery. Unlike most alleged turncoats, he wasn't rewarded with lands or titles. Instead, he vanished from history, possibly executed by the Crusaders despite their promises, or quietly killed by his own people. The Cathars who survived the siege's brutal end, over 200 burned alive in a single day, left no account absolving or condemning him. What remains is a Rorschach blot of medieval propaganda. To the Church, he was proof of heresy's moral rot. To modern Cathar sympathizers, he's a scapegoat for a defeat that was inevitable. Archaeology adds another layer. Recent excavations at Montséga reveal subtle signs that its fall wasn't just betrayal, it was exhaustion. Crumbling mortar in key sections suggests the fortress was crumbling long before the siege, its defenses neglected due to lack of resources or skilled masons. If the siege master did reveal weaknesses, they might have been plain to any experienced eye. Perhaps his real crime wasn't treachery, but admitting the truth, that no amount of loyalty could hold back the tide of history. The legacy of Montséga's fall isn't just about one man's choices. It forced medieval Europe to confront the cost of ideological war. The Crusaders, despite their victory, emerged stained by the massacre, their zealotry questioned even by fellow Catholics. The siege master's story, ambiguous as it is, became a cautionary tale about the price of uncompromising faith and the quiet, messy compromises that survival sometimes demands. High in the Pyrenees, the ruins still stand, their stones refusing to reveal whether they were betrayed by a man or simply surrendered to time. Betrayal isn't a single moment, it's a slow erosion, a crack in the foundation of loyalty that widens under pressure. To understand the psychology of a traitor, we must step into the dimly lit corridors of their minds, where fear, ambition, and desperation twist together like ivy on a crumbling wall. Historical accounts reveal these men weren't monsters by nature. They were craftsmen, soldiers, fathers, individuals pushed to breaking points we can scarcely imagine. Their choices, however unforgivable, were human, and that's what makes their stories so unsettling. Take the confession of a Castilian siege master, recorded in 1489 after he surrendered a key fortress to the Moors. Interrogated by his furious king, he didn't plead for mercy or spin tales of coercion. Instead, he spoke of nights spent listening to his children cough in the damp castle cells, of watching his wife's hands shake as she divided their last loaf of moldy bread. "A man can starve for honor," he said, "but can he ask his family to? His words expose the agonizing calculus of betrayal, the clash between abstract duty and visceral survival. For every traitor swayed by greed, there were 10 more who cracked under the weight of responsibility for lives beyond their own. Yet survival wasn't the only force at work. Some siege masters betrayed out of simmering resentment, their loyalty worn thin by years of disregard. A French engineer's diary, discovered in the archives of Avignon, details how he deliberately weakened a gatehouse after his lord mocked his warnings about crumbling masonry. Let him see how well his pride holds when the English march through. He scrawled in margins stained with wine. This wasn't just revenge, it was a perverse reclamation of respect, a way to force acknowledgement from those who dismissed his expertise. The psychological toll is palpable in his later entries, where guilt and vindication wage war in shaky handwriting. Then there were those trapped in the quicksand of coercion. Ottoman records describe a Hungarian engineer who switched sides after agents kidnapped his infant son, leaving a child's tiny glove on his workbench with a note, "Stone cannot bleed. Your boy can." For months, he fed the enemy minor defenses while secretly plotting to rescue his family until the Ottomans, suspecting his duplicity, executed them anyway. His subsequent suicide note, addressed to the castle's defenders, is a harrowing glimpse into a mind shattered by impossible choices. "I tried to be both father and loyal man. I failed at both." The most haunting betrayals, though, were those born of ideology. During the Hussite Wars, a Bohemian siege master famously joined the rebels after witnessing his own lord massacre a village of dissenters. "I built walls to protect the innocent," he later told his captors, "not to pen them for slaughter." His defiance cost him his life, but not before he'd redirected the castle's hidden tunnels to funnel rebels inside. Here, betrayal wasn't weakness, it was a moral revolt, a man tearing his own legacy apart rather than serving a cause he now deemed evil. What unites these stories is the aftermath, the hollow silence that follows a traitor's choice. Win or lose, they carried their decisions like ghosts. Letters from exiled engineers speak of sleepless nights, of jumping at shadows, of the way a child's laugh could suddenly remind them of all they'd sacrificed. Even those rewarded with riches often spiraled into paranoia, like the Milanese turncoat who hired food tasters after his own allies poisoned his predecessor. The psychological landscape of treachery wasn't just guilt or fear, it was the unbearable knowledge that no matter where they fled, they'd never outrun the person they'd become. Modern psychology might diagnose these men with moral injury, the anguish of violating deeply held beliefs. Medieval society had a simpler term, the traitor's shadow, the stain no sunlight could bleach away. Their stories force us to confront an uncomfortable truth that betrayal isn't the opposite of loyalty, but its twisted mirror. Both demand everything a person has to give. The difference lies only in who or what they choose to surrender it to. Stirling Castle in 1304 was more than just a fortress, it was the last defiant heartbeat of Scottish resistance. Perched on its volcanic rock, it had become the symbol of a nation refusing to kneel, even as Edward I of England, the Hammer of the Scots, tightened his grip on the Highlands. The siege dragged on for months, with Edward's armies circling like wolves, their trebuchets hurling fire and stone. But what finally broke Stirling wasn't brute force. It was a whispered conversation between the castle's siege master and the English king, a negotiation so secret, its details remain debated 7 centuries later. This unnamed engineer faced an impossible calculus. The garrison was starving, its walls pummeled daily by Edward's new Warwolf, the largest trebuchet ever built. Outside, the English king had made his terms brutally clear: surrender now and lives would be spared. hold out, and every soul within would swing from the battlements. The siege master knew Edward's reputation. This wasn't a bluff. Yet surrendering Scotland's most symbolic stronghold would brand him a traitor for eternity. His choice wasn't between loyalty and betrayal, but between two kinds of betrayal, of his country or of the men who'd trusted him with their lives. The deal he struck was as pragmatic as it was painful. Stirling would surrender, but only after a final, symbolic resistance, enough to let the defenders claim they'd fought honorably. Edward, ever the showman, agreed. He even paused his assault to let the Scots witness the warwolf's full power, its gargantuan stones reducing a section of wall to rubble in a single shot. The message was clear. Resistance was theater now. The siege master's negotiations had turned a military defeat into a staged performance, saving lives but gutting Scottish morale. Was it treason? Scottish chroniclers vilified him as a coward, claiming he'd been bribed with English gold. But dig deeper, and a grimmer picture emerges. Letters smuggled from the castle speak of children scraping mold from empty grain sacks, of wounded men lacking even rags for bandages. The siege master hadn't just surrendered a castle, he'd chosen mercy over martyrdom. Edward, for all his ruthlessness, kept his word. The garrison marched out unharmed, their lives traded for a fortress. The aftermath reveals the true cost of such choices. While Stirling's fall crushed Scottish hopes temporarily, it also exposed Edward's weakness. He'd needed negotiation, not just force, to take the castle. A crack in his invincible image Robert the Bruce would later exploit. The siege master vanished from records, perhaps into English service, perhaps into obscurity. But his legacy lingers in the uneasy question all commanders face. When does loyalty to a cause become cruelty to the people fighting for it? Stirling's stones still bear the scars of the Warwolf's barrage, but its deepest wound was the one no trebuchet could inflict the moment a man chose survival over symbolism and left history to judge whether that made him a traitor or the only sane soul in a war gone mad. Siege masters in fiction often get the dramatic treatment, cloaked figures whispering secrets in moonlit corridors, last-minute betrayals that topple kingdoms in a single night. But how closely do these tropes match the messy, complicated reality of medieval treachery? Take Game of Thrones' infamous siege of King's Landing, where a single turncoat engineer enables wildfire to decimate the city. It's thrilling storytelling, but real betrayals rarely unfolded with such cinematic flair. Historical siege masters didn't operate as lone wolves. Their treachery was usually a slow unraveling, tangled in logistics, personal grievances, and the grinding pressure of war. Novels and films love the idea of a single bribe or threat flipping a loyal defender, but reality was far more nuanced. Consider the difference between fictional portrayals and the actual siege of Antioch. In movies, a traitor might dramatically lower a drawbridge under cover of darkness. In truth, the siege master's betrayal was a series of quiet conversations, logistical sabotage, and careful timing, more paperwork than pyrotechnics. Real turncoats had to contend with skeptical allies, suspicious guards, and the very real risk that their own subordinates might refuse orders. A castle wasn't a machine with one lever to pull. It was a living system of people, any of whom could sound the alarm. Even the motives get oversimplified. Fiction often reduces betrayal to greed or revenge, but historical records reveal motives as layered as the castles themselves. A siege master might defect because his lord ignored warnings about rotting grain stores, or because enemy commanders promised to spare his hometown. The Borgias might have used poison and theatrics, but most real betrayals were less about mustache-twirling villainy and more about survival, pragmatism, or even misguided idealism. One area where fiction gets it right, the paranoia that followed Betrayal. After Château Gaillard fell, kings didn't just execute traitors, they redesigned entire command structures to prevent future treachery. That psychological fallout, the creeping doubt that poisoned trust between lords and their engineers, is something historical novels like Dorothy Dunne's Niccolo Rising capture brilliantly. The fear wasn't just of open betrayal, but of the quiet, invisible cracks it left behind. Perhaps the biggest myth is the idea that treachery always had immediate, sweeping consequences. In reality, even the most devastating betrayals were often just one factor in a larger collapse. Des Chevaliers fell not just because of its siege master's negotiations, but after years of dwindling supplies and political isolation. Fiction compresses time, turning slow erosion into sudden avalanches. The truth was messier, slower, and far more human, less a dagger in the dark than 1,000 small cuts to the ropes holding up a drawbridge. Yet these fictionalized versions persist because they tap into a deeper truth. Betrayal wasn't just a tactical event, but a story people told to make sense of chaos. When a castle fell, it was easier to blame a single villain than to admit how fragile the entire system really was. That's why the trope endures, from Shakespeare's Macbeth to modern video games, not because it's accurate, but because it reflects our timeless fear that the greatest threats don't come from outside the walls, but from the hands we thought we could trust. Rochester Castle's mighty keep had withstood sieges for generations, its towering stone walls a symbol of Norman power in England. But in 1215, during the bitter civil war between King John and his rebellious barons, it wasn't battering rams or starvation that doomed the fortress, it was the quiet treachery of the man who knew its secrets best. The siege master's defection wasn't just a military disaster. It became a turning point that would reshape English law and kingship for centuries to come. The castle's fate hinged on a single, brutal calculation. King John, infamous for his temper and tyranny, had surrounded Rochester with an army hell-bent on crushing the rebel barons sheltering inside. For weeks, his forces pounded the walls with Greek fire and siege engines, but the defenders held firm until the siege master made his move. Chroniclers disagree on whether he was bribed, threatened, or simply convinced the royal cause was inevitable. What's certain is that he revealed the castle's Achilles heel, the soft, sandy ground beneath the southeastern tower. John's sappers dug furiously, their tunnels propped up with wooden beams. Then, in a stroke of cruel genius, the king ordered the tunnels packed with fat from 40 slaughtered pigs. Set ablaze, the grease-fed inferno collapsed the tunnels, and the tower above crumbled like stale bread. Political aftershocks were immediate and profound. Rochester's fall broke the barons' rebellion, forcing them to scatter and regroup, but the betrayal's true legacy lay in its legal consequences. John's victory came at a cost. His brutal tactics, including the alleged torture of defenders after surrender, so horrified even his allies that it hardened support for the Magna Carta's principles. The document, reissued after John's death, included clauses specifically protecting against arbitrary punishment of castle garrisons, a direct response to Rochester's grim aftermath. What makes this betrayal so haunting isn't just the tactical brilliance of the sabotage, but how it exposed the fragility of feudal loyalty. The siege master wasn't some low-born mercenary. He was a trusted professional whose expertise should have made him immune to persuasion. His switch proved that in civil wars, where oaths tangled and loyalties fractured, even the most seasoned experts could be swayed. In the years that followed, English castles adopted grim new protocols, nightly password rotations, segmented command structures, and a chilling practice of taking engineers' families hostage during sieges. Rochester's ruins still stand today, their cracked masonry a silent testament to that fateful winter. The fallen tower was never fully rebuilt, left as a stark reminder of how quickly trust can crumble. For medieval commanders, the lesson was clear. The strongest walls were only as unyielding as the resolve of those who guarded them, and in the hands of a traitor, even pig fat could topple an empire. Unmasking a traitor in the medieval world was a deadly game of shadows and whispers, where a single slip could mean the difference between survival and the executioner's block. Siege masters who switched sides often left trails, sometimes careless, sometimes unavoidable, that revealed their treachery. Take the case of a Flemish engineer in 1389, whose downfall came not from grand conspiracy, but from a tavern brawl. After one too many ales, he reportedly boasted to a serving girl about the easy gold he'd earned by sketching a castle's weak points for enemy agents. By dawn, the girl's brother, a garrison soldier, had alerted his captain. The engineer was dragged from his bed, still reeking of wine, and hanged from the castle gates before midday. Letters proved just as dangerous. In an era where parchment carried secrets, sieges bred a cottage industry of spies and interceptors. A Burgundian chronicle describes how a siege master's coded message to the enemy was unraveled because he reused a cipher from his youth, a pattern his own apprentice recognized. Others were undone by their handwriting. When the Duke of Brittany suspected treason during a 1426 siege, he ordered every scrap of outgoing correspondence compared to known samples. A single mismatched stroke in the letter R exposed an engineer who'd been feeding information to the English for months. Some betrayals came to light through sheer bad luck. During the siege of Orleans, a French commander grew suspicious when his siege master kept insisting a particular tower was impregnable, a claim contradicted by fresh cracks in the mortar. Setting a trap, he spread false plans about reinforcing that very section. Days later, English sappers tunneled directly beneath it, their precision too exact to be coincidence. The siege master's hurried midnight flight confirmed his guilt, though legend says he didn't make it far before the Duke's horsemen ran him down in a wheat field. Then there were the betrayals betrayed. A Spanish engineer in Granada, deep in Moorish pay, was himself exposed by a junior mason hungry for reward. The younger man had noticed strange mortar mixtures being used, formulas that weakened walls under pressure rather than strengthened them. When he reported it, the engineer's elaborate double life collapsed. His punishment, forced to repair the very defects he'd created, then sealed alive inside the wall as fresh mortar entombed him. The most chilling reveals, though, came from within families. In 1511, a German siege master's own daughter turned him in after finding enemy coins sewn into his cloak lining. Her motive wasn't loyalty to the crown, but fury over her father's plans to marry her off to an elderly ally. The records are silent on whether she regretted her choice after watching him broken on the wheel, but the event sparked a macabre tradition for decades after. Lords required engineers' daughters to swear oaths of vigilance, their loyalty held as collateral. What's striking isn't just how these traitors were caught, but how often their downfall stemmed from human flaws, pride, drunkenness, carelessness, rather than clever detective work. Medieval justice relied heavily on fear and chance, trusting that the weight of guilt would eventually tip the scales. For every siege master who escaped to enjoy his blood money, a dozen more left behind telltale signs: a nervous glance at the wrong moment, an uncharacteristic interest in guard rotations, or the fatal mistake of underestimating the watchfulness of those around them. In an age without forensic science, betrayal left its marks not in fingerprints, but in the uneasy silence of a room when certain topics were raised, or the way a man's hands might tremble just slightly as he pointed out a castle's strongest wall. Corfe Castle crouched on its Dorset hill like a wounded beast in 1645, its once proud towers scarred by cannon fire and its royalist garrison clinging to defiance. The English Civil War had turned this medieval stronghold into a last bastion of King Charles I's crumbling cause, its strategic position controlling the Isle of Purbeck, making it a prize worth any price. But as winter deepened, the castle's fate rested not with the parliamentarian forces encircling it, but with a man who had spent years maintaining its defenses, a siegemaster whose name would become synonymous with treachery. The betrayal unfolded with chilling precision. For weeks, the royalist commander, Sir John Banks, had repelled assaults, trusting his siegemaster to shore up weak points and ration dwindling supplies. Then, on a sleet-choked December night, a gate mysteriously jammed open. Parliamentarian troops flooded the outer ward, their advance so unnervingly precise that defenders later swore the invaders moved like men following a map. By dawn, Corfe had fallen without the bloody last stand everyone expected because its keeper of secrets had traded them for survival. What drove such calculated treason? Contemporary accounts point to a web of motives. Some claim the siegemaster, facing starvation and no hope of relief, struck a pragmatic deal to spare the garrison's lives. Others whisper of parliamentarian agents exploiting his debts or threatening his family. But the most revealing clue comes from a tattered letter in Dorset's archives, where a royalist officer scribbled that the engineer had grown sick of dying for gentleman's pride. In that phrase lies the tragedy of civil war, where loyalty fractured along class lines, and a professional craftsman might resent bleeding for nobles who'd never shared his bread. The aftermath was brutal even by Civil War standards. Though the siegemaster reportedly received payment 30 pieces of silver, sneered the royalist broadsheets, he vanished into obscurity, likely fleeing England to escape his former allies' vengeance. Corfe itself suffered a symbolic execution. Parliament ordered its walls systematically slighted, reducing the fortress to ruins as punishment for its defiance. The shattered keep became a monument not just to military defeat, but to the era's unraveling trust. Yet this betrayal's true legacy was psychological. Corfe's fall proved that in civil conflicts where brother fought brother, traditional bonds of fealty meant nothing. Military handbooks of the 1650s began advising commanders to rotate engineers between posts, lest they grow too attached or too resentful of any single garrison. The war's outcome might have been decided on battlefields, but its soul was laid bare in acts like this. A man who knew every stone of a castle, choosing which hands deserved to hold its keys. Today, Corfe's broken silhouette still whispers that the deepest cracks in any fortress aren't in its walls, but in the hearts of those sworn to guard them. The ripple effects of these betrayals stretched far beyond collapsed walls and fallen kings. They fundamentally rewrote the rules of warfare. By the late medieval period, commanders no longer saw castles as mere stone obstacles, but as delicate human systems where trust was the most vulnerable point. This shift birthed entirely new military doctrines. The French, after losing Château Gaillard, pioneered rotating engineer policies, ensuring no single person knew a fortress's full defenses. Venetian arsenals began stamping serial numbers on siege engine blueprints, tracking which craftsmen had access to sensitive designs. Even the terminology of war changed. The old Latin word for traitor, proditor, gained a chilling new prefix in military manuals, proditor mechanicus, the betrayer of machines. Loyalty itself became a calculated risk rather than an absolute virtue. Renaissance commanders like Machiavelli openly advised princes to assume all experts were potential turncoats, recommending carrots and sticks, generous pensions paired with dire consequences for disloyalty. The Spanish developed an elaborate loyalty ladder system, where siege masters advanced through ranks only after their families had been vetted across generations. This paranoid mindset birthed modern intelligence networks. What began as lords spying on their own engineers evolved into the elaborate counterintelligence webs of the 30 Years' War. The psychological scars ran deepest in fortress design. Post-betrayal castles featured treason-proof innovations, double-locked armories requiring two unrelated officers' keys, murder holes positioned to cover interior courtyards, even decoy weak points meant to mislead potential turncoats. At Rhodes, the Knights Hospitaller went further, designing entire sections that could be collapsed remotely if defenders suspected insider treachery. These weren't just architectural tweaks, they were physical manifestations of broken trust, stone and iron reflecting the era's deepening paranoia. Yet the most enduring legacy was philosophical. The medieval ideal of unshakable fealty gave way to a colder, contractual view of allegiance. Mercenary companies flourished by offering betrayal insurance, binding oaths backed by massive financial penalties. Kings began treating military expertise as a commodity rather than a sacred duty, creating the professional officer corps that would dominate early modern warfare. When Shakespeare's Henry V declares, "Every subject's duty is the king's, but every subject's soul is his own," he's echoing this seismic shift, one sparked by generations of siege masters who chose self-preservation over blind loyalty. The ultimate irony, these betrayers inadvertently made warfare more humane. As castles grew harder to undermine from within, besiegers turned to negotiation over assault, leading to more conditional surrenders. The specter of treachery forced commanders to treat skilled personnel better. Fair wages, respect for expertise, even early forms of veteran benefits emerged to cement loyalty. In their darkest acts, these traitors unwittingly laid groundwork for the professional, rules-bound militaries we know today. Their legacy isn't just shattered stone, but the uneasy understanding that in war, as in siegecraft, the strongest defenses are those built to account for human frailty. Acre in 1291 was a city holding its breath, the last ragged outpost of the Crusader kingdoms, clinging to the Levantine coast like a shipwrecked survivor to driftwood. For weeks, the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil had hurled his armies against its walls, his siege engines reducing towers to rubble while defenders fought street by street in a desperate retreat. But when the final collapse came, whispers slithered through the smoke. The Mamluks hadn't just broken Acre's defenses, they'd been let in. The name of the accused siege master is lost to time, scrubbed from records by ashamed chroniclers or perhaps deliberately erased, but his alleged betrayal didn't just topple a city. It slammed shut a 2-century chapter of holy war, proving that even faith could crumble before human frailty. Rumors of treachery swirled from the first breach. Witnesses reported Mamluks moving with uncanny precision through the city's labyrinthine alleys, bypassing barricades to strike at undefended weak points. One account describes them emerging from a crypt beneath the Templars' headquarters, a tunnel known only to a handful of engineers. Another claims they scaled a section of the northern wall where fresh mortar had mysteriously failed to set, the stones coming loose like loose teeth. Most damning, the speed with which Khalil's forces located the harbor chain's mechanism, severing Acre's lifeline to the sea in minutes. These weren't the blunders of a panicked defense. They were the fingerprints of someone who'd mapped every vulnerability. The siege master's motives remain a Rorschach blot of medieval guilt and propaganda. Crusader chroniclers painted him as a Judas, seduced by Mamluk gold or terrified by their reputation for slaughter. Muslim sources, keen to frame their victory as divine will, suggested he'd recognized the inevitable and chosen mercy over martyrdom. But dig deeper and a more complex portrait emerges. Letters smuggled from Acre in its final days describe a city rotting from within, food riots, plague, and noble families fleeing on bribed ships while commoners starved. If the siege master did collaborate, was it truly greed that drove him, or the grim calculus of a man watching children gnaw on boiled leather in the streets? The aftermath was apocalyptic. Acre's fall triggered a domino collapse of remaining Crusader holdings, extinguishing the Latin East forever. Survivors who made it to Cyprus told horrific tales of the final hours, Mamluks butchering prisoners in the cathedral, flames swallowing the Hospitalia quarter, waves choked with bodies as desperate refugees overloaded boats. Yet amid the carnage, one detail stands out: the alleged traitor's fate. Unlike most turncoats, he wasn't paraded in triumph or rewarded with lands. He simply vanished, likely slaughtered in the same massacre he'd hoped to avoid. Colil, ever the pragmatist, had no use for a man who'd betray his own. What lingers isn't just the betrayal's brutality, but its symbolism. Acre was more than a city. It was the final flicker of a dream that had obsessed Europe for generations. Its fall forced the West to confront an uncomfortable truth: that holy wars weren't lost on battlefields alone, but in the quiet moments when ordinary men, pressed between survival and faith, chose to lower their own drawbridges. The ruins of Acre still lie buried beneath modern Akko, their stones silent witnesses to the day an era ended not with a clash of swords, but with the turning of a key in the wrong hands. The lessons of medieval betrayal echo eerily in the modern world, not in crumbling stone fortresses, but in firewalls, nuclear silos, and encrypted networks guarded by today's siege masters, cybersecurity experts, and military engineers. The same human frailties that undid castles' greed, ideology, coercion now threaten systems far more complex. Consider Edward Snowden's revelations in 2013, where a single systems administrator exposed global surveillance programs, or the Stuxnet worm allegedly sabotaging Iran's nuclear facilities through insider knowledge. These aren't just breaches, they're digital sieges where the gatekeepers became the saboteurs. Modern parallels reveal how little has changed. Medieval lords took engineers' families hostage. Today, blackmail leverages personal data. A Ukrainian power grid operator in 2015 allegedly aided hackers who plunged cities into darkness, while Chinese cyber espionage cases often involve bribing corporate insiders for blueprints. The tools are sleeker, but the playbook is ancient. Exploit the human element. Even loyalty is monetized now. Bug bounty programs pay ethical hackers to expose vulnerabilities, blurring lines between defender and mercenary. Yet the stakes are exponentially higher. A medieval traitor might topple a castle. A rogue engineer today could destabilize a nation's infrastructure or trigger a financial collapse. In 2017, a disgruntled Tesla employee reportedly tampered with factory systems while funneling data to outsiders. No boiling oil or battering rams, just a keyboard and resentment. This is the new siege warfare, where betrayal doesn't require physical access, just a password and a motive. Defenses have evolved too, mirroring medieval paranoia. Just as castles compartmentalized knowledge, modern systems use zero-trust architectures where no single person holds all access. Biometric checks replace oath swearing on relics, and AI monitors for anomalies like sudden data downloads digital equivalents of watching for engineers sketching weak points. But the core vulnerability remains. Trust is a system's weakest link. When the U.S. Navy convicted nuclear engineer Jonathan Tobe in 2022 for selling submarine secrets, it proved that even the most guarded fortresses, literal or figurative, can fall from within. The most chilling parallel: just as medieval betrayals reshaped warfare, modern ones are rewriting global power dynamics. cyber mercenaries sell expertise to the highest bidder, much like Renaissance condottieri. Whistleblowers and spies operate in moral grey areas, echoing the Cathar siege master who chose conscience over crown. And like their medieval counterparts, modern traitors often justify their acts as righteousness, exposing corruption, resisting tyranny, or simply surviving in systems that exploit their skills. Yet there's a paradoxical hope in this continuity. Medieval betrayals forced societies to value loyalty differently, leading to professional armies and fairer treatment of specialists. Today's breaches are pushing similar reforms: better pay for cybersecurity staff, ethical hacking channels, and international norms against digital sabotage. The ghosts of Château Gaillard and Antioch remind us that while technology advances, human nature doesn't. The strongest firewalls, like the thickest castle walls, will always be vulnerable to the oldest hack, the human heart. From Château Gaillard's fallen walls to Acre's smoldering ruins, the echoes of betrayal remind us that stone and mortar are no match for human frailty. These siege masters didn't just topple castles, they shattered an era's illusions about loyalty, exposing how easily oaths crumble when faced with gold, survival, or disillusionment. Their stories form a dark tapestry of medieval warfare, where the most carefully laid defenses could be undone by a whispered conversation or a deliberately weakened gate hinge. What chills the bones isn't the scale of their treachery, but its intimacy. These weren't faceless invaders scaling walls. They were trusted men who knew every creak in the floorboards, every shadowed passage where danger could slip through. When the siege master of Harlech Castle lit those fatal signal torches, or when Antioch's defenders sketched secret weak points for the enemy, they proved that true power lies not in towering walls, but in the knowledge of how to circumvent them. Their betrayals forced kings to confront an uncomfortable truth. You can engineer perfect defenses, but you cannot engineer perfect loyalty. Yet within these grim tales lies an unexpected paradox. The very betrayals that devastated medieval kingdoms also pushed warfare toward modernization. Faced with turncoat engineers, commanders developed sophisticated systems of checks and balances, early blueprints for the chain of command structures modern armies still use. The paranoia bred by siege masters' duplicity gave rise to intelligence networks, personnel vetting, and even early concepts of cybersecurity, as lords realized information was as valuable as any sword. In their darkest acts, these traitors inadvertently built the foundations for more accountable, transparent military institutions. So as the dust settles on these ruined castles and forgotten names, we're left with questions that transcend medieval history. How thin is the line between pragmatism and betrayal? Can any system truly guard against human nature's capacity for self-preservation or ambition? The siege master's legacy isn't just in the battles they swayed, but in the uncomfortable mirror they hold up to our own modern world, where firewalls replace drawbridges and insider threats remain the most devastating of all. Now we turn to you. Would you have held fast like Stirling Castle's defiant engineer, or might the pressures of war have bent your resolve? Let the debate begin in the comments below. And if these tales of stone and treachery have gripped you, join us for more journeys into history's shadowed corridors. Hit subscribe so you never miss a story where the walls have ears, and the keepers of keys sometimes turn them in the darkest hour.